constantly surveying to people during homilies that the RH bill is an evil thing, that God will punish you because meal orders from Claret and hash browns or something. This means that the church has great influence over the way these people think Madam Chair. That these people really listen to the church. They praise the church, Madam Chair. They worship it, and that's why it's so easy for the church to mold their mindset. Second thing is that once these people buy into what the church wants to do, it's beyond reason already. Why do we say it's beyond reason? Because you can't convince them anymore, because it becomes a dictate from God. It becomes a requirement of their faith. It becomes a commandment that they have to follow. It's no longer something that they can rationalize to themselves. We don't want this because we think it dirties the sacred process, Madam Chair, of actually being able to choose for yourself what kind of models you want in your country based on your own personal values and not what the church is dictating to you. And that's why we don't want these churches meddling in national affairs. Let's go on to my second argument on why our model will be an effective way to enforce the separation of church and state. We see that churches are non-profit organizations. This means that we are forbidden, Madam Chair, from engaging in activities and operations which will give them a profit, Madam Chair, such as business transactions and things like that. Instead, churches primarily exist for the purposes of gathering followers and organizing the religion, for building church structures and things like that, for missionaries and for good deeds like sending missionaries to teach children and all these sorts of things. All these things involve millions and millions of pesos. Just to build a church, Madam Chair, you're going to need 25 million pesos to 100 million pesos just to create the structure, the design, and all those sorts of things. And so these churches really need this money. But the thing is, they can only rely solely on donations to the church, budgets allocated by the Vatican to them, and things like that. There's no other way to get the money. So they need to hold on to the money as much as they can, which is why we think that removing their tax breaks will be such a great impact on them. Because without that sort of money, they wouldn't be able to operate, Madam Chair. They wouldn't be able to perform their purposes and their function. And that's why we think it's going to be a strong enough disincentive to ensure that they don't meddle within the church. Because they're not going to want to lose their money. They still want to be that good guy that helps everybody and, gathers more followers. And that's why we think they're going to stop. That's why we think we're going to create an effective way, because you give them a great enough disincentive to actually not want to do it. Madam Chair, we told you what the problem is. We told you what's wrong. We gave you a solution, and we told you why it works. And for all these reasons, xxxxxxx is glad to propose.
Lipat kami. Lipat kami.
When people say the Philippines is a highly Catholic country where the church enjoys an uncontestable amount of support and influence from the people, we think it is one of the greatest lies in modern day society. Catholicism, ladies and gentlemen, has evolved into such a faith, or such a cafeteria faith, where people that are still nominally Catholic decide and choose and pick the parts of the faith that they like in accordance to other things that they have developed affinity for. We think that we are not the blind mice anymore. That's why while the RH bill is having difficulty being passed, it's also very difficult to just shut it away and to dismiss it, because there are people amidst being nominated Catholic who still dare and bold or be bold enough to support this type of move. That's why the church is no longer content with particular arguments of you're gonna go to hell if you use condoms, but they actually have to explain issues on life, on development, on poverty. Have you ever heard the ridiculous argument on how overpopulation, for example, is not really an existent phenomenon in the Philippines? We think, ladies and gentlemen, we do not see, however, no things, that there are still staunch followers of the faith and that they do exist in status quo. However, we think that they are no different
one anymore. I'll do this under two arguments. One, that it's legitimate for religious organizations, to engage in political affairs, and that second of all, political involvement does not negate all the other public functions of religion that still aid the state in their forms of non-monetary contribution. First of all, we think that it's legitimate for religious organizations to engage in political affairs. Because if you look at it, why was the concept of separation of church and state even created before? Because before, you cannot differentiate between political prowess and the capacity of people to lead and church organizations being blessed as rulers, entitled to the seat of God. They don't even have to earn it anymore. But now, if you look at it, both politicians and both state values and religious values are pretty much equal in terms of competing with each other in different sets of people, in different sets of groups. We, ladies and gentlemen, that if you look at it, or the way democracies work, there is no single unified way or correct way anymore of looking at what is an ideal leader, looking at what is the political system, and how it should operate. That's why you're now trying to recognize all particular advocacies under it, even though those groups of people that decided to clump under particular organizations. We think that why do religions need to call their religious authority anyways, and not just their set individual opinions? Because advocating for the interest of your religious group is no different from advocating any other type of interest. We think that intangible interests, for example, like the salvation of people's soul if they so choose it to be, or for example, the advocacy of the values of your particular religion being realized, or in terms of human rights treatment, or specific treatment to manifest in society, are all legitimate advocacies as well the church is learning to defend. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that we're not saying that you should always follow the Catholic Church, but we are saying that you should be allowing them to compete, and that these people have a right to participate in the democratic process because they have legitimate interests of protecting their members, of protecting individuals, and of protecting particular people. The burden in government now is to provide us this particular logic of why the separation of church and state is still necessary at this point in time. Okay, Joe, before I go on, yes.
So far, that's an unnuanced argument for speech in its unadulterated form. But secondly, you have to nuance why exactly it's the church who is the only authority who can advocate on any kind of matter that you want to advocate for.
They're not the only ones who can advocate for it. We don't have to prove exclusivity of advocacy because there are a lot of feminist groups as well, or charity organizations who aren't the only ones who can advocate for a very particular cause, but you give them privileges nonetheless, and you allow political participation if they so choose it to be. What's the second argument? Political involvement does not negate all other functions of religion that still aid the state in non-monetary contributions. The first question we want to ask is, and the question I asked Liane was, is it really exclusive, the privileges that you give to religions? We think no. Who else gets privileges? You give them to NGOs, to organizations that have other advocacies as well, even if they're highly political in nature. In terms of that, or in terms of charity organizations, for example, who only want to give it to particular types of women, who want to give it to particular types of people, you subsidize them as well. Why were the privileges created? On the first level, because there are particular public functions that these organizations actually fulfill. That in the only way that you can enhance them or allow them to continue, as Liane has argued for us, is to allow them these types of tax breaks and exemptions. And we think that you provide them these privileges in the recognition that especially in a third world nation like the Philippines, it would have been especially difficult for the state to fulfill all of these public functions comprehensively without them. You recognize their efforts and non-monetary contributions by attributing monetary incentives for them. At the second level, it's even more so far, it's even so much more special for the church because there's one specific function that only they can fulfill for some individuals. That is the religious and the spiritual growth of some individuals and their full actualization in the democracy that values functional individuals. The state operates under the framework of development that humans are biopsychosocial spiritual beings that recognize the particular development of an organization is only dependent, or of an individual is dependent on the spiritual aspect being fulfilled as well sometimes. What's the conclusion? This is not an argument of intent on why the church does it, but this is an argument of commensurability to make sure that they get what they deserve in terms of tax breaks in recognition that they are contributing in their own non-monetary forms. And on the last level of this argument, we are willing to reduce the privileges of the church in the future, but not based on political
you an example of how to make a non-clash in a debate, and now I'm going to show you an example why the Centuple X has not brought a single ballot to this tournament. First of all, let's talk about the supposed non-differentiation between charitable, educational, and religious organizations, which is why what Valerie said essentially is this: let's let them participate in the church in political affairs, and Madam Chair, because of this, then let's just let them engage in the market of public discourse. But the problem with this, Madam Chair, is that there's something that differentiates the church from simple educational and charitable institutions. And what is this? This is the reciprocal, bilateral, concomitant relationship between the church and the state. Because the church promised that I'm not going to interfere in church affairs, and the church cannot interfere in state affairs. Because that's the reason, Madam Chair, why the state, for example, cannot compel the church to say, hey, you have to allow women priests. Because there is that separation that has to exist. And the church cannot tell the Muslims that, hey, you cannot allow people to marry multiple times. Because, Madam Chair, of this concomitant relationship that does not exist with charitable organizations, it does not exist with educational institutions, that's not because the state can regulate educational institutions. That's why UPD, which is a regular institution, can limitate it in terms of budget, in terms of curriculum, etc. Same with charitable organizations where you can operate and where you can participate. The church, if it's purely ecclesiastical affairs, quote unquote, that's something that's a tagline in this debate, the state cannot. So what we're doing here is we're having a mismatch. It's incommensurate. The state still cannot participate, but the church now can participate in the marketplace. Where is the logic in that validity? Let's talk about the second argument. Let's talk about why the entire case of negative side is actually anchored on one flimsy premise. And this is the one which she said in her first minute, that we are now cafeteria Catholics. Never mind that it just talks about one religion. No, it doesn't talk about Muslims. It doesn't talk about Ignacio or more religiously fanatical organizations. But Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, remember, if that premise of Valerie that people don't really listen to the church anymore falls, the entire side falls. So you have to take note of that, Madam Chair. And also, we see here that just because it doesn't go against the principle of the argument, because she said this, the church right now technically cannot participate in political affairs. But anyway, let's let them participate, because while they're violating this rule, people don't listen anyway. Let's assume the premise is not right. Then, Madam Chair, you see the faulty logic coming into this argument. It means that people can break laws, institutions can break limits, as long as people supposedly don't limit or don't listen to them anymore. Like, I can attempt to rape girl X. If she's not gonna agree anyway, then that's okay. That is akin to the logic that they are forwarding. Madam Chair, also, that argument will fall because it makes a hasty generalization that everyone now are nominal Catholics or nominally religious. But what about people who are still adherent to their faith, Madam Chair? Of course, that argument ignores it. What we want to do is to err on the side of caution, knowing that people can still adhere to particular stances and principles because their church said so, or like in Iglesia de Cristo, which is a continuing phenomenon of the block vote for president, like when they voted, well, we don't always win, but they block vote, and that is the evil in itself, Madam Chair. And that in itself can't have a negative implication, and that's not something that we can countenance in this debate, Madam Chair. Let's talk about my arguments, but before my arguments, save your case.
Are there charitable organizations that also vote?
Sorry, what?
Are there also charitable organizations involved in politics that also block vote?
Correct. Yes, maybe there are. I don't know. Yes, there are. So there are. Okay, let's assume that there are, Madam Chair. We see here that the realm of discourse is different between the charitable organization and the religious organization. Why? Because the religious organization talks about the doctrine of salvation, of ecclesiastical affairs, and it goes into the afterlife. So it goes beyond the realm of logic and politics, Madam Chair. So if you're using that to compel people to agree with you, how can it be countered by other discursive elements? Because there is no match between the otherworldly and the worldly. Okay, let's talk about the first argument after that point of information. Let's talk about why there's an incommensurate situation right now. Let's talk about the separation of church and state as a bilateral promise. But the problem is there are unequal remedies. Right now, the church, as I said, the state rather cannot interfere in purely ecclesiastical affairs, and they still give these churches tax breaks. And if they violate it, you have a remedy against the church. That's why there was a key Supreme Court case in 1995 when the state attempted to un-excommunicate a priest. The Supreme Court said, well, you cannot do that. That's purely ecclesiastical. There's a remedy against the state. But what about when the church interferes with political affairs? We see here that this is a promise that cannot be enforced and cannot be regulated, Madam Chair. You can't file a criminal case against the state or the church. You can't decertify them or prevent them from doing missionary duties because that goes against the freedom of religion. Meaning, there's no remedy right now. But the problem right now is that, in fact, they fail to realize that you can separate the personal from the political. Meaning, Madam Chair, the church doesn't have to interfere in the sphere of political affairs as they want. Meaning, they don't have to say, pass the RH bill. Meaning, it can pass, but there can still be a personal engagement between the state and its followers working. Even if technically you can allow the distribution of condoms, they can still tell their followers, well, I don't think that's for our faith. So meaning, if they really want to engage in the marketplace of ideas, then they can still operate on a personal level. But what we're taking them out of is the market of political discussion. And that's something that they have to disengage from. Yes. And now, we see here that okay, now let's talk about why this remedy strikes a balance. And the second argument, in fact, let's talk about the freedom of speech and participation. There is protected speech and there is unprotected speech right now, Madam Chair. And we see here that when is speech unprotected, when it's libelous, when it interferes against privacy, etc., meaning you interfere with matters that are outside of your jurisdiction, i.e., for example, you interfere with private affairs. We see here that church affairs are not dependent on who is in power. Meaning whoever is the president there, the church can operate in the same way because again, the state never legislates on the exact operations of the church. That is why they don't have to immerse themselves into the realm of the political because it doesn't directly affect them. That goes outside of their jurisdiction. Meaning any speech that goes against this particular kind of limitation has to be deemed unprotected and has to be something that can lead to certain remedies like what Liane already talked about earlier. Now, Madam Chair, we see here that at this juncture of the debate, we have a policy with the remedy. They never went against our remedy, never talked about tax breaks, not a single mention of tax breaks except for the charitable and educational organizations. Right now, they're simply challenging a premise that we argue is not exactly there, i.e. cafeteria Catholicism. It's something you can generalize. And that entire case is based on that flimsy premise. If it falls, they all fall.
before I move on to my issues. First, to my basis. Number one is when they said that, well, they made a promise, they made a concomital, whatever the wrong word was, to each other. I think there was no real day when that was timed, right? So we don't think there was really anything exactly. But more than that, we think it's a tautological argument. Because just because the separation of the church and state exists today, he said that we should strengthen it without even viewing the value of it per se. Especially when Val already told you that institutions are enough to question each other and the circumstances are different unlike they were before. So we think that's not really arguing or rebutting any of our questionings of the intrinsic value of the separation itself. And if that's the problem, we think it's also fair the church, the state, starts questioning the church. If the church, ladies and gentlemen, can question the state, and if that's your problem, the church is shielded, we don't think there's any real problem in making the state allowed to actually question the church. We didn't the church fight back then, if that's your problem. We didn't the state and the church fight each other off. We don't see a problem with that because they believe they're both solid institutions right now in status quo. But secondly, he said they had to prove the idea that material politics. I think that's not true. Because if people follow the church, then that's good. They still made a choice, ladies and gentlemen, to put their spirituality first. If they don't, it does not diminish the value or other values of the church, like the things that Val mentioned, that are for the public, like education, like healthcare. So we think it's not our burden to do that, and even if that premise falls, all our cases will still remain to be alive. But secondly, he said, ladies and gentlemen, that there's such a thing, we're going to allow the church to influence personal decisions. And that's where it gets really tricky, because I don't understand why or where the line is drawn exactly between a personal decision and that of a political and spiritual decision. We think these things, especially at this point in time, are inextricably linked, such that my spirituality can influence my political views and vice versa. Because a decision is always multifaceted and a person is always multifaceted. So we think if you're going to allow personal decisions, wow, that's such a bad concession to make in this debate. Because implicitly, you're also assuming that we are correct, that there is indeed a value in the spirituality of it. Why are you then so afraid to let the church preach it out, ladies and gentlemen? But lastly, he said that, I can't really understand. He said that we fund other charity institutions, even if they have political claims, but we can't fund the church. And his basis was that, other political institutions and other influences are logical. Since when was that the standard, ladies and gentlemen? Or when to actually fund something, or when to award something? We think a lot of other beliefs society proposed by charity organizations, like feminism, like clans, ladies and gentlemen, like political ideologies, aren't logical as well. They're highly based, ladies and gentlemen, on the belief of the individual to their particular cause. So rationality and logic, ladies and gentlemen, has never been the main reason why the church allows these kinds of beliefs to flourish in status quo. No thanks. I have two arguments for you in today's debate. Number one, I'm going to argue that this policy is dangerous because it wields too much power for the state and makes them have undue hegemony that stifles discourse. We think the state is the most powerful institution in any country, not religion, ladies and gentlemen, because state only has the legitimate authority to be coercive and to transcend between ethnicity, race, religion, age, and gender, something no religion has, ladies and gentlemen, because even Catholic values are questioned by other religious values, etc., etc. We think their proposal, especially when Liane says, ladies and gentlemen, that it's going to cripple the church, is akin to cutting off subversives and not making discourse flourish in society simply because the church is threatened. And we don't think this is a value we're willing to defend in any liberal democracy. Because essentially, on the first level, we tell you it's unfair. You allow all other beliefs to sway people's beliefs in ideologies, in campaigns, in family values, culture, ideology, political dynasties, ladies and gentlemen, but you're undermining the right of the church as a protected institution to do the same. You are disqualifying them, ladies and gentlemen, from the fight of ideologies, and you're disqualifying them from the fight of discourse. We think this is untrue and this is unfair. But on the second, we said it builds too much power for the state. No thanks. Because essentially, it's like silencing subversives. We think the essential question to ask right now is this. If at any point in time, the church and the state values were parallel and there is no divide between it, do you think that the state would say, shut up, church? We don't think so, ladies and gentlemen. They are scared, not because it's essentially wrong what the church is fighting for, but because their power and their hold to power is threatened by a different ideology and a different worldview. So we think, if they were the same, I bet that the state would be fine with that increased say that knowing is the best president on earth. But they don't do that because at this point in time, conveniently so, they happen to have different beliefs. What does this prove? It proves that there's such big power for the state. They award, ladies and gentlemen, citizens who are good to them, and they deny subversives, like what they do with the CPP, the NPA, or whatever kind of ideology that threatens them. It's the same thing, and it's akin to churches. Because the most fundamental way by which you can harm churches and their beliefs is by taking away the funding, by taking away the tax breaks, as they had so conveniently proved in their first speech. So we think on that level, what this does is to undermine discourse, and that's bad. Because the value of every liberal democracy is to let as much views flourish and as much views contribute to what is good, and let society continue to exercise their freedoms and make anything that the church is necessarily a part, ladies and gentlemen, of this kind of society. But secondly, I'm going to argue that it will individuals. Again, like I said in my rebuttal, we think individuals necessarily are multifaceted people. Their choices are multifaceted as well. It's explained and influenced by a lot of things in the world, like money, like, I don't know, color, like gender. We think these things are all valid issues to be put when you make a decision. What's the problem, ladies and gentlemen, when you shut the church up? We think you are going to deny the individual of the proper avenue by which spirituality is being reminded of. Because we think when you ban people in churches and priests, in mosques and churches, to say that the origin is bad because such and such, the spirituality such and such, ladies and gentlemen, we think you flood other people with different influences outside of society. Why Mono is there? Why Manny Pacquiao is a good boxer? Why race and gender is important? But you cancel out the spiritual avenue. Thereby, the choice that's produced isn't really maximized. It comes from a restricted pool of choices already. And I think this is particularly important because we want to maximize the choice of individuals, and I think genuine choice is made with a pluralistic view, and that's something we're proud to defend. Thanks.
Madam Chair, I want to clarify 3 things. The first clarification I'm going to make is that this is a blatant misdirection of what the debate is supposed to be. They told you, coming from first speaker, that their burden was to rethink the separation of church and state. This is not the burden for the debate, but the burden that they're supposed to be answerable to is why churches should maintain privileges despite their involvement in politics. So we don't necessarily they're fulfilling the clash of emotions sets them out to do. But if that's what they want to do, we can answer this burden that's here. We can also answer that thing. If we can prove that the divide is indeed legitimate, then we say that we win. And we can also prove that their rights should be stripped, should they involve themselves in matters that are beyond their jurisdiction. Second clarification I want to make, Madam Chair. What exactly constitutes as a political act? Because I keep saying, what if it intersects? Because, giving alms to the poor is political as well as it is, spiritual. So we tell you, and this has been clarified from the get-go, coming from Liane, when we're talking about political statements, these are things that are up to the negotiation of the democratic process, up to the discretion of negotiation, such as whether or not to pass a bill, whether or not to elect a guy, and things like that. Things that, for example, let's feed the poor, or let's pray for the victims of Ondoy, or things like that, are not political statements. These are moral, these are not moral, these are uncontestable things that anyone can really make. This is not political, it's charitable. Thirdly, the last clarification I want to make is they tell us it's a contradiction. Why can you let priests speak if you cannot, if individually, if you don't want them to make statements? This is the difference. Because, for example, if Patrick was a priest, nobody would believe him. If so, it's limited only to his diocese. It's different when you have the goddamn archbishop with all this scope, with all this gravitas, with all this reach and authority, telling people what they should be doing. And we think that's the fundamental harm when he uses that position to be able to influence and reach people with things that priests cannot really be reasoned with. In fact, we encourage priests to tell people that you have, to follow the same delineation. 2 issues for you today, Madam Chair. The first one is, are the church and state fundamentally separate, and is this legitimate? Why should we then impose this penalty on them? And second, are churches' statements, or being able to make political statements, essential to its function? So we're going to prove to you that they're just being meddlers in the political process. Go.
If you were to think about it, you're against the number of people these things are influencing. So the arbitrary number between 5 and say 100, you're okay with 5, but not with 100.
No, we're not okay with nobody, Patrick, being able to tell you something. But we're okay with that. We're not okay with Oscar Table or whoever's name is, I'm sorry, being making statements on behalf of 1 million people or more in this world. First issue, are the church and state, are they fundamentally separate? Because we already told you, it's something that they failed to debunk. The reason why we give tax breaks to the church is because they are a non-political entity as defined by the Constitution. Meaning, taxes are the concretization of your political involvement. If you're involved in the political process, if it's legitimate that you be involved, then we tax you. But we say, if you want to be involved in the political process, then it's only right that you remove this privilege because A, you're already participating in the political process, therefore it's only fair. But B, you're already overstepping your constitutional bounds as to what something, as to your role in society is supposed to be. But then they challenge us. It's the subversion of elements that may be against the state. But we tell you, this is where you best strike the balance, coming from Glenn. We're not prohibiting you from speaking up, but we're tempering the kind of speech that you can make because we tell you that not all speech is protected speech, and there are particular forms of speech that are illegitimate. You can speak, but you have to pay up for it. We don't see why this is necessarily morally reprehensible if they want to redefine the roles as stated by the Constitution. But on the second issue, are the church's statements essential to its operation as an ecclesiastical body? First thing they tell us is that they have to lobby for exclusive interest for their denominations and things like that. Two responses for this. First, we say it's not exclusive. There are a lot of NGOs out there, a lot of political interest groups that can clamor for the same thing. But second, when we have the nuances to the church, we have to take a look at things given that all kinds of lobbying come with baggages. What kind of baggage are we supposed to allow? And we tell you the problem with the church is the baggage that they bring is a kind of reasoning that you can't reason with because their reasoning is not founded on reason per se. Which is why we don't think it's a legitimate obligation, a legitimate kind of thing that we should allow our politicians to be beholden to. The second idea under this issue is that they have to make statements to fulfill social functions. We've already dealt with this when we told you there's a separation of a charitable and political act. We tell you that these political acts are things that should be left for legislative discretion, right? When you tell people to vote, when you tell people to campaign for a particular bill, those are political acts. We don't necessarily see why these political acts or whatever results of them change the way the church is run anyway. If you think about it, the non-involvement of the church goes beyond the Constitution. Because whatever happens to the state, no matter whom we elect, it doesn't affect the way the church teaches its doctrines. It doesn't change the way the church teaches and dispenses dogma. It doesn't change the way that the church dispenses food to people who need it. So we don't necessarily see why the church has a say in a particular body that does not involve them anyway. But lastly, under this idea, they told us is that you disqualify them from speech, although it's an infringement on the freedom of speech. But Glenn already told you this idea that if you take a look at all the crimes of unprotected speech, disclosing state secrets, disclosing private correspondences, infringing on the dignity of other people. If you essentialize these things, these are essentially banning individuals from making comments, no matter how to, on particular matters that they don't have any jurisdiction in. So we see because they don't have any jurisdiction there, they cannot make any comments on things that do not concern them. But lastly, this is the most frightening thing. They tell us that the church really doesn't have any kind of sway. But we don't think necessarily it's the same thing. You have congregations that continue to block vote, you have masses of people that refuse to listen to reason, and this presents a harm when you allow the church to unleash these forces to continually infringe on how the democratic state conducts itself. And we don't think it's fair that the state does not have any recourse to repeated, multiple, and wanton intrusions on its authority. So in the sake of democracy, if you want justice to be fulfilled, there has to be commensurability. If you want people to be involved, there is a price to pay. You have to give up your privileges. You cannot keep operating beyond the sphere of reason. You have to descend to our level and remove these privileges. Give them up if you're going to come down from heaven and act like one of us. Thanks.
People could say Noy is good because his parents were good, and we accept that as a legitimate reason why you support that person. We don't understand why it has to go to the extent of like why religions cannot be the same basis to begin with. Because we believe if you can accept reasons such as political dynasty, if you can accept reasons such as feminism, then which are all which could be unfounded beliefs, then why can't the same apply to religion? It's unfair because most beliefs are unfounded to begin with. And second of all, let's talk about this whole thing about the priest and a certain group or an archbishop and a diocese. The point still stands that at the end, that it's not just that the numbers don't exactly matter. The point is they still can be able to reason with a certain amount of people and still exert influence. So we don't understand why it's considered unfair when you have a bigger reach in terms of people, because we say the same can apply with celebrities or whatnot or anyone else. So it's completely unfair of them to believe that it only applies to certain things like religion. But third, let's talk about how they were talking. Let's talk about how the whole thing that the church cannot. Basically, it's like this: the church only has one avenue, which is through its people, through its stance. But on the other hand, if people themselves decide to opt out of their religion, decide to opt out of certain things such as block voting, for example, then we say they can easily do this. The point is, here, it takes a lot, sure, we can see it. The point is, we don't take away their brains. But the difference is, with a church at hand, what you're essentially doing is, they don't have any other avenue if you decide to silence these people. And it's something that we find essentially problematic, because what you're doing is cornering certain sectors of society who have an equal stake in their followers at the end of the day. So we believe this is inherently unfair.
First point, disagreement.
No. Let's go on to my two issues in this debate. First, let's talk about how does the church even work in status quo to begin with, and what differentiates religious nature. Because they kept saying that, there comes a point that the church is already overstepping its boundaries. But to the state. Because if you want to talk about active participation, they already do that either way to begin with. So it's unfair on their part as well on what they're trying. And so it shows you in itself that there's a contradiction between what they're saying. Because the fact of the matter still stands that the churches, that there is still some certain needs that are fulfilled by these organizations that nobody else can fill to begin with. But aside from that, we say that the fact of the matter is they kept saying that, well, these people can always just talk about things as organic as people themselves. That, they don't need to be in a certain group and you still have your marketplace ideas. The point still stands that the person law removes them from being listened to begin with. It doesn't allow them the ability to be able to be listened to as a bigger group. And even if we did, it's simple as this. The way people formulate their values, part of the bigger way they do this is part of religion or what they inherently believe in to begin with. They're just exercising what they believe in based on what they've learned or whatnot. And the same could apply to any other standard, like the feminist standard or whatnot at the end of the day. So we believe that what they're essentially doing is unfair because what if people just have the same values and decide to congregate on that and form some organization? It's the same thing at the end of the day. So we believe that what they're doing is unfair. And lastly, they said, you have to err on the side of caution in this case. That, no matter what, you're going to have to make sure that these people are able to, that, you have to make sure that there is nothing that's going to detract from political discourse. But at the end, we say here that it's inherent to the political discourse to have this sort of religious mindset because that's inherent to who your people are to begin with in society at the end of the day. And we say that this is part of the way society even interacts to begin with. So at the end, it's clear that we here on the opposition side have won this debate basically because we're able to protect our principles to begin with and just goes to show you that they don't really know what's happening in the Philippines, unlike us in UPD.
Grabe.
Nakaka-stress to.
It's funny when they accuse us of never responding to their frame that people will blindly follow. Whatever happened with argumentation, talking about how even if people blindly follow, that's okay. How dare you accuse us of not responding to this? Because my entire case was talking about how it's legitimate to believe in whatever it is you choose to believe in. Especially if you can see that even if charity organizations block code, you still provide them particular benefits in your side as well, right? And that's blindly following, isn't it? Even if you refuse to listen to competing charity organization, even if you refuse to listen to counter narratives to your particular advocacy, why is the church any different then? I'm even not sure if at the end of the debate, blind following is a harm or a standard we're trying to use. Because charity organizations are not only allowed on your side, but apparently, according to Glenn and to Joe, if it's only just one priest and not an archbishop, it's okay. So wait. It's not blind following. It's a number of people. It's a number of people logical, does that make the food I give that person any less valuable? Will he not be full? Will he not be able to sustain himself for days because I give it to him because I'm going to heaven? I don't think so. Apparently, the only thing, apparently, we even needed to prove that they're the only ones who can lobby for this. Well, didn't I analyze an entire case on how spiritually those particular needs sometimes can only be fulfilled by the church for some people, and this debate is not about passing a value judgment on whether or not that's correct, but whether or not the government should respect that. And now we think that you do, and you should. We think that even if there are other organizations that can fulfill those particular functions, even assuming the best of it, doesn't the government subsidize competing organizations with the same purpose? Like, for example, charity organizations who are good for feminist causes or who are good for poor people. You subsidize all of them because it's not based on redundancy of function, it's not based on the logical need of your health, but the fact that you contribute to society and you deserve what you get. We think if you want to talk about deserving what you get, then UPD wins this debate. Thanks.
First point I want to contend with is this entire argument that goes through the opposition side saying that if you can accept arguments from feminism, or if you can accept arguments based on political dynasty, why can't you accept ideas coming from religion in the marketplace of political ideas? Never mind the fact that it has been consistently refuted, even preempted from Liane, that there is a difference between true and false, meaning feminism or political dynasties, either they exist, they're good or bad for us, as opposed to religion, which is the dichotomy of earthly and divine, meaning you cannot refute it with earthly evidence or logic. Why? Because religions cannot be disproved by earthly evidence. Meaning when Manny Pacquiao quotes the Bible in the RH Bill debates, because it says here that go forth and multiply, the only way to refute it is for another congressman to say the Bible is wrong. And that is why, Madam Chair, it's something that cannot be engaged and cannot be taken into account in this kind of debate. And second, we see here, and this is they ask why not, because I can hear their voices. Now, they say, just because you, and they also say, Madam Chair, just because you allow reasoning outside of logic, it doesn't mean that you should do it, or it doesn't mean you should listen to it. That's why, even in legislative and judicial proceedings, we do not allow racist or libelous statements. You can make decisions based on racist ideas, but you do not say it, Madam Chair, because we strip it of its place in that kind of arena. Even hard slings campaigning or mudslinging in the political arena, you can make decisions based on that, but that doesn't mean that it should be given the airtime in that particular sphere of discussion. There's a big difference that we're talking about. Okay, Madam Chair, the second thing I want to talk about is this. They said that these organizations still supplement the state, meaning that sometimes they give money to charity, sometimes they help the poor. But of course, that doesn't respond to the frame of the debate, just like the entire case. Because we're talking about political and not charitable. We already differentiated earlier on with because if it's charitable, it's not necessarily left up to legislative discretion or judicial discretion. Meaning, nobody will necessarily say that they don't give naman money to the poor. Because Madam Chair, we see here that if it's something like the RH bill, it can go either way if it's up for debate. If it's something like the divorce bill, it's either way, it can be up for debate. And we want to take away their voice in that particular kind of realm. But Madam Chair, if we talk about charitable and we talk about educational supplementing, Madam Chair, that's not within the debate. Because that's not within the realm of what we want to differentiate. In fact, Madam Chair, we already distinguished why we treat charitable, educational, and religious institutions differently. Because charitable institutions, because they have very different bases, Madam Chair. For charitable institutions, they supplement the carrying on of the state or of the state mechanism. For education, they indoctrinate the children or they give them instruction. But for the exemptions or privileges given to the state or that are given to the church, it's based on the very principle of separation of church and state. It's three, not two. In fact, when we talk about the separation of church and state, it means that the state promises, I won't interfere into affairs that are purely yours if you don't interfere into affairs that are purely ours. So the gray area where we talk about charitable and educational help, that's outside of the debate. That's why I said, this is why the state cannot say to the church, you let women priests be elected or you let women priests be ordained. That's why the church cannot tell Muslims to change the Quran or the Christians to change the Bible. It's purely ecclesiastical. So because we give them this privilege, also these statements cannot be made concomitantly or in reverse by these particular institutions. That's why, Madam Chair, when we talk about the motion, it's an entire sentence, no? They only talked about the last three. The church should disengage, or rather, the church should engage in politics. But because they want to desperately box out Liane from the debate, this entire discussion about privileges granted into the was not talked about at all. And that is something that we cannot countenance and something that we cannot tolerate. Last time, we talk about the difference between personal and institutional. Meaning, Madam Chair, there's something different about saying from ex-cathedra, from the top of the church, do not vote for politicians who support the RH bill. Vote for Brother Ed. Vote for Gilbert Chodoro. There is a sense of officialness, Madam Chair. But we also talk about how you can separate that from the personal, Madam Chair. Day-to-day interaction of people who approach the church on their own volition. I talked about the distinction of the personal and the political. Madam Chair. Anyway, Madam Chair, with that, Ateneo XXX submits that not only did we fulfill the burden given by the motioner side and the other side didn't, we also submit